young fellows that were showing up were not like that at all. They were intelligent. They were very dedicated to serious historianship. Amazingly, they were all committed Christians. Most of them had good family lives. And this happened to me over a period of years. You saw one of these students, Kerry Roberts, earlier in the thing. This happening, which I was unexpected and completely unearned and unjustified, that these fellows showing up to study history, and I guess there were 6 or 8 or more of them over a period of years, is the proudest part of my whole professional career, that I was able to do this and to sponsor these fine young fellows. And they all taught me much more about it, a great many more things than I taught them, I think. And nobody taught me more than Dr. John Devanny, whose expertise on economics, both historical and current, and economic history is the broadest I have ever encountered. And Dr. Devanny is now he's at Christendom College in Virginia. And his broad understanding will give us, I think, a great tool for understanding the situation that we are in now on who owns America today. And I think we all feel now that we're in troublesome times, trying times, and there's something rather wrong at the core of our society. And it's not a very pretty picture, but I expect that Dr. Devanny will enlighten us a great deal about our current historian situation and our historical situation. Thank you.
What Clyde really meant to say was because in my misspent youth I was a stock jobber and continue to be one to this day, that's why I get this particular topic. One thing I would suggest about Dr. Wilson, most of the arguments in the Congress are about money. It's how it begins and that's how it remains. There's lots of other topics that are a little bit more flashy that come up from time to time, abortion, slavery, this, that, or the other thing. It's money. These people argue about political economy. And Dr. Wilson was really the one scholar who understood how incredibly perceptive and incredibly deep and profound was the thought of John C. Calhoun on political economy. I do know of one other professor who's written a bit on this, and it, quite honestly, it was a pretentious piece of baloney. I remember Clyde had given me a paper that he had given to a conference on Calhoun's political economy, and I still refer to that paper to understand that period of time. So, and he's lying, he taught us a lot more than we ever taught him. So, be that as it may. So, who owns America today? This is a hard topic because, yeah, the doomsday devil's still at it, right? They always put me in front of supper, and I'm not sure why that is the case. And so I'm sure, like, here I'm a little sleepy at this point, I've heard enough, and I'm kind of hungry, and I want to get out of here. So I will not bore you with such things as counterparty risk, hypothecation, rehypothecation, yada yada, and all the other jargon that goes with Wall Street. They do the jargon on purpose. It ain't that difficult, honestly, but they do the jargon on purpose. So what I'm going to do instead is give you really 3 chunks. One chunk is going to be, okay, given certain measures, they're not exhaustive, they're selective, but certain measures, where do we stand today? Who actually owns the thing? And I can tell you right now, we can't boil it down to this person. I know we'd all love to say it's George Soros. He's in there, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. The second thing is to take a look at what these folks, at least some of the contributors to Who Owns America, had to say about this. And the comparison, are we better off or worse off? I think you know what it is. And lastly is to say how we got there. When that slide comes up, no, I promise it's not a second whole lecture. We're going to just take some observations on some general reasons why we got into the mess we did, and finally just a few thoughts on what can we do. This can be a dull, dry topic, so I will do the typical hyperbole, humor as much as I possibly can, and all the rest of it. If I do, it's a southern audience, so I can do that. Some of the northern students that I teach, it takes them about 4 weeks to get used to all that, and the storytelling drives them up the wall too. So for y'all, it'll help keep us awake as we look at the topic. You notice the graphic I chose, wonderful how it's sort of like blocking out, the dark clouds are coming over this beautiful sunset over the fields. That's pretty much where we're at. I could almost leave it there and take questions, but on we go. Or not go. Alrighty, so let's start with the land, because that's what the agrarians and some of these distributist authors were most interested in at the time. 28% of the land is now owned by the federal government in one fashion or another. Good news, nearly 60% is in hands of private people. State governments own another 8.5%, 8.6%. Native Americans, about 2.5%, and then county, state, local governments, not even quite 1%. Okay, that doesn't seem so bad so far. A little much for the feds, but we'll go with that. Let's take a look at the bigger picture of real estate ownership. Let's kick out houses for a second. We'll just look at non-home owning real estate type things. So non-home real estate. Well, 1% of households owns 40% of that. 9% of households owns 42% of the non-home real estate. Ouch. The rest of us all, we own about 18%. The top 100 largest landowners in America own 40.2 million acres. That's an area approximately the size of New England minus Vermont. Vermont's not a very big slice, right? I wish it was Maine. So, wow, that's a little bit of consolidation going on there, isn't it? It's something else. So, sorry, take me a while to get this out. This graphic here, what's showing us to your left-hand side, the bottom part of that graph are the owner-operated farms going back to 1964. The top part are those who are renting and leasing. It's stayed more or less stable. Actually, it dipped its most in 92. And we're seeing a little bit more owner and operation, but really you're talking about close to 30% to 35% of these farms in a given decade or year are actually leased out. They're not owner operated. The other thing that's interesting is that where you see from 2002 to 2012 it kind of levels off there. That's because a lot of families are now putting farmlands in trust. They're trying to avoid taxes of transference. Not just federal estate taxes, but state estate taxes can be very heavy. Doing whatever they can. In fact, female ownership of farms is up enormously. I think close to 40%, maybe a little over 40%. And the other curious thing about that is if you look at females over the age of 70, they own about 15% of the farmland. They're sort of the last ones standing in the family, and they've got the land. One last thing to mention, I'm afraid that a lot of my data is old. It's kind of funny. A lot of it relies on the census, or there's this occasional study done from time to time. So when census data comes out and Land Institute and some of these other places begin to do new studies, it'll look worse than this. I had a buddy of mine who was a contractor for many years. He taught with me at St. Joseph's over in Greenville. And he would laugh about this fellow who was Croatian that he had. And Steve would have a terrible day. Stuff wouldn't arrive. The electricians were being electricians and all the rest of it. Stuff's falling down. And the guy would look over at Steve and he would just say, "Don't worry, Steve. Tomorrow will be worse." Well, it's probably worse. Over to your right, the acres owned by non-farm operators. Well, we have a kind of interesting thing going on. Again, we see a lot of owner-operated farms in this, but when you slice out these farms that are actually farmed by tenants in this case, I have to get in here a little bit, sorry. I'm horrible with graphics. A number of these farms are corporate owned, or they're organized as corporations. So you got a significant number of these farms that are leasing out that are organized as corporations. That doesn't mean it's Monsanto. It doesn't mean it's Archer Daniel Midland necessarily owning their General Mills. What we are seeing, though, more and more is that putting your farm into some sort of corporate organization gives you a lot of tax benefits, possibly opens you up for some grants, things of this nature. I expect that trend to accelerate as farmers get older, a statistic that we're going to see in a second. Also, a lot of those farms that are individually owned and operated, if they're large, and I'm thinking for me a large farm is 1,000 acres or more, it's generally organized like a corporation. These people will go ahead and buy futures against their crops as insurance. They will have everything computerized. They tend to treat the soil as a medium that's neutral. So they will measure out everything they possibly can with respect to water, nutrition, things of this nature. They run it very much as a business. This is not Wendell Berry or Joel Salatin out there. This is a business. And they will even take soil depletion on an annual basis into their accounts as they do this without necessarily doing anything to help stem that soil depletion. Though some of that is beginning to change here and there. Some of the corporate folks are figuring out, yeah, we really do have to reserve some of this soil as we go forward. But in any event, those are our trends in farmland. So, zooming on. So to continue on, you want to be a farmer? Well, the Department of Agriculture says that if you produce $1,000 worth gross of crops that you sold at the local farmers market, hurrah, you're a farmer. You might even be able to apply for grants. 30% of American farmland is owned by non-operators, as we mentioned before. The median age is 55. By the way, that is similar for tradesmen, electricians, plumbers, carpenters, what have you. The 1990s push to get everybody into college was a boon for colleges and for independent schools. That boon is ending. But it was not a boon for the trades. You can see where Generation Z might go in the future when it comes to education. The other thing, too, farmland, it's attracting foreign investment for sure, and it certainly is attracting institutional investors. Why? It's a great hedge. Right now, I don't know how many are in the investing world, but you might recall they had the old formula that, hey, you basically invest in the amount of stocks that your bond portfolio should look like your age. So if you're 20, you should be 80% in stocks, 20% in bonds, and you adjust as you go up, and you want to be diversified, so buy some mutual funds and the index funds. That's all absolute baloney, man. If you want to be diversified, you better be diversified across asset classes, which means stocks, bonds. It also means real estate. It also means cash. And yes, don't let them hear this at Wall Street, gold or silver. You really have to be invested across this. Your big money, sometimes known as the smart money, knows this. They are buying up farmland. Hedge funds are buying farmland. But why? Why go into farmland? Iowa farmland values. They're it's one of the most liquid markets, and it's one of the best researched and reported on markets around. 1970, $419 got you an acre. Today, 2016, $7,183 will get you an acre. I went ahead and did an inflation adjustment. That's an inflation adjusted return of 642%. That's pretty darn good. That's a heck of a hedge. Buy y'all some farmland, Oh, by the way, there are now these trusts out there where individual investors can, much like a fund, go ahead and buy shares in these trusts that will buy farmland, and you will get a percentage of the rent or the percentage of the crop and whatnot. So this is taking off, man. It really is. Foreign ownership. If you took all foreign ownership, you have the size of Virginia. That's how many acres foreigners own. And we're talking about foreigners as individuals and also as corporations and what have you. China, I know China is the big baddie right now. They do own about 400 farms. They're very interested in Kansas in particular. If you follow this sort of thing, and I'm kind of a nerd, so I do, the Gobi Desert is wreaking havoc with the wheat growing regions in northern China. And as desertification continues apace, they're like, well, nobody's living in Kansas, which is true. Some of these Kansas counties, their population has fallen below the level of the 1890 census. They're technically wilderness. I'm sure there's a number of Native Americans who would like it back. So they're buying farmland heavily out there, and it's very good wheat land. Italy and New Zealand also own significant acreage, especially New Zealand for forage, which is interesting. And the Saudis, the United Arab Emirates, also own the equivalent of Rhode Island. Not huge, it's our smallest state, right? But they do own the equivalent, again, also for forage. I haven't seen any camels out there foraging on their land, but they do, pack it up, bundle it, and ship it back over in those cases. It's not that much, but it is very significant. More importantly is the trend. The trend seems to be accelerating. Especially if you are an investor overseas and you're looking at the average age of the farmer, you're looking at the currency markets, you're thinking, there's lots of reasons to invest in farmland. And it gives you a lot of different options to do so. So that trend will probably continue apace. Let's see if I can work this thing. So let's go to the homes. Who owns our mortgage? As of August 26, 2020, the Federal Reserve Bank owns nearly 30% of American mortgages. Almost 70% of all mortgages are owned or guaranteed by the United States government. Following agencies: Fannie, Freddie, FHA, VA, USDA. They almost own the entire market. As soon as you get a mortgage, that mortgage broker is sending it off to Fannie Mae. So yeah, government owns your house if you still have a mortgage on it. Wow, if that's not consolidation, I don't know what is. Incredible. So, that's real estate. What about companies? Surely the American businessman is out there fighting independently the tides of consolidation. 3 investment firms as of 2017 had $11 trillion under management. These are BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. They control huge amounts of stock, and here's how they do it. How many of you, if you sort of kind of pay attention to your retirement account, and that wouldn't be you, Professor Trotters, I understand, how many of you realize that you are invested probably in index funds of some sort or another? In other words, you're buying the whole S&P, you're buying the whole bond index, etc. Well, here's the deal. You own shares in the fund, whether it's a mutual fund or an exchange-traded fund. You do not directly own the securities. BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, as well as other companies, they are the guardian. So when it comes time to vote the stock at the shareholders meeting, they're voting these huge blocks of stock. But wait, it gets worse. One of the things that makes this worse is circular ownership structures. It's not as if BlackRock will necessarily have a fund that owns a majority position, but everybody owns a piece of everybody else. So, the 3 largest shareholders in BlackRock, or who are the largest owners of BlackRock, are Vanguard, the BlackRock Fund, one of BlackRock's funds, and of course, Capital Research and Management. They're all interlocked, interconnected. It is a really interesting web. One study I did see that I didn't put up here was very interesting. They were like, well, exactly how do these funds vote? 90% they vote with management at the shareholder meetings. Rarely will they go against any kind of management proposal. Rarely. So if you want to lead a shareholder war, you decide you've had enough, you bought some shares, you're going to speak at the meeting, you're already defeated. Trust me. They've already got the blocks. So, federal and corporate linkages? Oh no, there, perish the thought, right? The government and the free market are tangling with each other, fighting each other. Corporate America versus the federal government. Oh no. We have revolving doors all over the place. Take a look at the top people in the agricultural department and take a look at where they work after they leave or before they came. Goldman Sachs has owned the U.S. Treasury Department for about a decade now. It just revolves, man. It just revolves over and over again. Regulatory capture. Who do you put in control of regulating these people? You hire people from the finance industry to work at the SEC. And they can't wait to get out of the SEC because they make a lot more money at Goldman and JP. So there it stands. Informal ties. I love this. I like to pick on BlackRock. They used to run my wife's retirement fund when she was a nurse, and they had CIA ties, and Blasey Ford was tied in with them through her daddy, too. It was hilarious. In any event, Larry Fink, who was the founder and CEO of BlackRock, in 2008, he contracted non-competitive contract, no other bidders. He contracts with the federal government for $12 trillion. Gosh, I just would have taken one. I could have cleaned up that mess, right? $12 trillion in government contracts in 2010 to help fix the financial crisis. He had ties to the Clintons all over the place. So you look at the people that were rolling into BlackRock, they're all Clinton people, and they're rolling back out. It's hilarious. He was being pegged for Secretary of Treasury. Oh, he was disappointed when Mr. Trump won that election. Terribly disappointed. So in any event, there are wonderful sources on this in both the scholarly press and the popular press. It's there. Let's go shopping. Off to the grocery store. So we go shopping. 400 major brands. All those brands you have in your pantry, they're owned by those companies, more likely than not. More likely than not. So it's the usuals. If like me, I mean, this is one of the terrible things that we are facing. It is a trend. Better people than I identified this trend a long time ago. If you want to have exposure to India and China's market as capital begins to shift there, buy Procter & Gamble and Johnson & Johnson. You could do worse. They are rapidly getting footprints into those countries. So it's all global. Oops, going back. So what about the media? Surely the media is on the job with this. Surely they are reporting about this. Surely they are letting us know, like Paul Revere, they are getting the American citizenry riled up. Well, 90% of what I call the legacy media, not the independent media, there's still some good independents out there. I'm not even going to mention the names, and ironically, most of them are on the left, curiously enough. It's pretty much these people who own all that. And they own news, they own cable, they own all kinds of different channels. If you're watching it, they own it, more likely than not. You have all seen those wonderful, wonderful YouTube clips of local newscasters broadcasting the exact same script across the country. YouTube didn't start putting those up on people's feeds until they caught Sinclair doing it, who they claim Sinclair is to the right. You know, oh, Sinclair's doing it. They're all doing it. They're all doing it. No, you got to go independent media because you are not going to get, forget it. It's just terrible. In any event, there it is. So if you want some consolidation, there it is. This is probably beyond the dreams of Tate and Agar and the boys as they were writing this book. This is how bad it is. And as I said, there are all kinds of rabbit holes you can go down on this. I'm just giving us the big picture here as best I can. So, who owns America? What were these fellows concerned with? I was really looking for the quant stuff. I was pretty familiar with the old agrarian arguments and what have you, concerning corporation and whatnot. So when they were looking at this thing, what scared them? Now, to do them justice, they understood clearly that consolidation was a problem long-standing of both political and economic power. One thing that was cited by Lyle Lanier, 200 corporations own 50% of the country's industrial assets. And they were very worried about that. That looks pretty good now because most of those assets are financialized. Most of those assets are owned by the large commercial dealer banks and investment houses across the world. So it's not even as if you simply have a corporation where the board is holding the majority of the stock, where you actually have people invested. A guy who I follow, he was saying, I found a gold explorer where the guy who directs the company, the board director, owns 36% of the stock. That's incredible. He has skin in the game. Now, it doesn't exist that way. So all of this has now been financialized. All of this is really concentrated up on Wall Street. 25% of mortgages financed by the federal government. Well, we saw what happened to that. And then life insurance companies finance 60% of the country's mortgages. They don't touch it. They'll maybe underwrite the PMI and some of the other things, but generally speaking, they're not touching that at all. The mortgage market, it's hilarious. It's pretty much captured by either the Federal Reserve as they're expanding their balance sheet, or it's been captured by various and sundry government agencies. Curious. So, who owns America? A little bit of analysis and a little bit of hope, maybe. The authors were critical of corporations having the status of person under law and limited liability, eroding personal responsibility, and the artificiality of finance capitalism. Yes, they were, without a doubt. I do think they didn't quite understand how rapidly the economy would financialize, how quickly these assets would be gobbled up, how credit could be used in all kinds of different ways to consolidate, to take over, to strip down industries, all the rest of it. And they shouldn't be blamed for it. There were a lot of people in business who couldn't see that either. But nevertheless, they were deeply concerned with these things. They're even worse now. They're terrible. I mean, J.P. Morgan got caught with its hand in the cookie jar in the silver market for years. Anybody who traded silver knew that J.P. Morgan was up to no good. So I'll tell you a little story. A former trader and analyst, Max Kaiser, decided that he had had enough. He hated J.P. Morgan. He gets on his show and he says, everybody go out and buy physical silver. We're going to actually put J.P. Morgan in the biggest short squeeze ever because J.P. was naked shorting silver at the time. Well, if everybody starts buying silver, they got to cover the short. They got to start buying silver too. The SEC came in and hammered them immediately. How dare you go out and buy silver? Don't you dare pick on J.P. Morgan. Meanwhile, J.P. Morgan has been caught spoofing accounts, front-running their clients. And what did they get? A fine that is a rounding error in their weekly revenues. There it is. These fellows also did something else that was interesting, and Clyde, you'll have to correct me about this if I'm wrong on this point, but they saw that, hey, with cars and roads and electricity, maybe we can use this new technology to get back to decentralization. We can sew back in the homes. Cars can be used for delivery. This might actually help get us around the corner. They weren't wrong, but the problem with technology is it's a double-edged sword. It cuts both ways. And you're not in control of the marketing of those products. You're not in control of where the road goes. You're not in control of the car. There's bunches of things that you're not controlling. So they did have a hope that technology might help break this up. It didn't happen. The authors who directly address economic centralization, they thought the federal government at least potentially could view this as a neutral player. The government could come in and be the referee. You see this with Ransom, for instance. Ransom's going to give all kinds of power to the federal government. And when I'm reading his essay, I'm thinking, whoa, man, really? You trust these people? But they did. And the populists, to some degree, did as well. Because it's 1800 again, isn't it? If we just capture the government, we can turn this thing around. But it's a very different government you're trying to capture at that point. And that's a tough thing. So, La Lanier, the federal government could use taxation to encourage a greater distribution of the fruits of corporate enterprise. I ain't going to do that. John C. Raw, a Jesuit, he also assumed the government was a neutral referee. And then, of course, Ransom advocated federally chartered corporations, right? And the federally chartered corporations could increase shareholder liability, limit size, and all these things. Here's the dirty secret about the Constitution and chartering. There was a debate about this. You can find it in Madison's notes at the Philadelphia Convention. They directly, explicitly voted down federal charters. When the bank bill came up on the floor in the 1790s, Jimmy Madison says, wait a second. We were all at the convention. We voted down chartering corporations. You can't have a bank. And there's Roger Sherman, God bless him, who basically on the floor says, I don't remember it that way. You know, we need a bank. The problem with the idea of rules, James Buchanan, the great Nobel-winning prize economist up at George Mason University, now retired, maybe deceased? He may be deceased at this point. He said, look, because of the situation, we got to have rules and we respect the rules. I'm telling you, you read the first Congress, they did not want to respect any rules. Pennsylvania's like 5% tariff. You're out of your mind. We need at least 30 to protect the iron industry. You're crazy. And poor Jimmy Madison is out of his tree thinking, that's not what we agreed to back in Philadelphia. It's politics. It's politics. Frank Owsley is the one author who identifies the predicament. And basically, he understands it comes from the influence of Hamilton. A quote from him, I dare not contemplate how many Americans are this day ready to trade any residue of abstract liberty which they still may claim to in exchange for bread and circuses. Insert YouTube cat videos and whatever else. Owsley got it. He understood that that was the problem, because the promise of the Hamiltonian system had little to do with government stability of finances in time of war. It had a lot to do in the long run with, if you allow this regime to come into place of consolidated finances and consolidated government, we are going to give you prosperity beyond your wildest dreams. You know, that was often the case. And if you read the economic historians on this is why they do praise Hamilton. He made us a great country. Look at all the stuff we have. So, how do we get here? This looks very daunting, but I promise that we will go fairly quickly on it. Capitalism, let's first define this. And one of the interesting things when you talk to especially a room full of libertarians, they can't even define it. And I'm going to give you a definition that kind of smushes some economic historians together with stock jobbers and how they look at it. So, it's basically the employment of capital by any morally lawful and useful means in the act of producing goods and services to acquire wealth by making a profit. Capitalism is not the free market. You can have capitalism in any number of different markets. You can. Ask the Chinese. You can have it under any different number of regimes. Okay. Now, there's problems with the free market if you're a capitalist, and we'll get into those in a moment. All right, so two proto-capitalists considered. Let's go all the way back to the dawning of the modern era. The plague is over, hooray. The Wars of the Roses, well, they're getting ready to get up again, but at least the 100 Years' War is over, hooray. The famines are over, hooray, and Jacques Coué is born. Jacques Coué was a textile magnate in France. And Jacques did not want to have to negotiate with every little guild in every little town to put his business in France. So he goes to the king and he cuts a deal. He says, "King, build me roads, build me warehouses, give me exemptions from guild restrictions in the towns, and I will give you gifts." We would call these taxes. And the king was, "Yes, I want this. I need an army, because right now there are 5 dukes with a bigger one than I have. So I need an army and I would like those taxes." And so Jacques Coué begins to get money to build roads, to build port facilities, to build warehouses, whatever. I don't see a free market there. Jacques was getting the kinds of advantages that no other individual textile owner was getting at the time. But my favorite are the Fuggers. The Fugger family, the great mining and banking family of the Holy Roman Empire. The name actually used to be spelled F-U-C-K-E-R. I ran across an entry, the Fuggers have arrived. Well, yes, they have. Let me read to you Jacob Fugger, 1523, in a letter to Charles V. Quote, "It is well known that your imperial majesty could not have gained the Roman crown save with mine aid." Takes money to bribe these electors, right? "And I can prove the same by the witness of your majesty's agents. In this matter, I have not studied my own profit." Perish the thought. "For had I left the house of Austria and been minded to further France, I had obtained much money and property, such as offered to me. How grave a disadvantage had in this case accrued to your majesty and the house of Austria, your majesty's royal mind well knoweth." Charles V was easily the most powerful monarch at the time. And you basically have a banker telling him, "Look, son, if you read the whole letter, pay up and give us the concessions we need. If not, Cardinal Richelieu, or whoever is in France at this time," it wasn't Richelieu at this point, but Richelieu would have taken the deal, "we will be more than happy to make the deal with the French, your sworn enemies." It's not the 1980s or the 1920s or the early 2000s when Wall Street is acting like this. They didn't invent it. Once you see the consolidation of capital and government, and this symbiotic relationship. There's now a contest for power and advantage. And Charles can't disentangle himself from this, right? Not very easily, because the world of finance is now emerging. If you ever read The Merchant of Venice, it has far less to do with Jewish folk and a lot more to do with emergent capitalism and the changing of values in the commercial society of England. A lot to do with that. Acts of incorporation. Yes, the corporation does become a person, but I'll take you through this. This is kind of interesting too, what happened here. Acts of incorporation were originally given to universities. They get the charter, and because they're performing a public good. And interestingly enough, medieval universities, at least on the basis of class and wealth, were far more diverse than, say, the Ivy League today, which was curious. So over time, in English law and even in other law codes, you had to prove a public good. Where this changes is Massachusetts. There's a lot of guys who want, it always does, right? A lot of folks want to put mills in. But the problem with riparian rights under common law is you can't mess with the river in such a way as to deny people downstream use and enjoyment. So the mills used to say, well, wait a second, we're providing a public good and making money. And the public good is we've got this grain mill that can mill for the farmers, so we should be given this exemption. Once the cat got out of the bag, bam. And my favorite is this. I can't imagine me saying this, poor Alexander Hamilton. It took him 7 years to get a charter for the Bank of New York. Still in business, by the way. 7 years of toil and sweat. His great rival, Aaron Burr, does it in record time because he says, oh, well, my company, manufacturers, we're actually going to have a waterworks. We're going to bring fresh water to the city of New York and do a little banking on the side. We're giving you a public good. Oh, that sounds wonderful. You get a charter rapidly. Hamilton is just screaming to the heavens over this, and manufacturers never delivered one drop of water to the city of New York. The public good test was destroyed in Massachusetts and destroyed in New York as well. And once it was gone, it was really a formality, right? A piece of form that you would put in to try to get your corporation chartered. And to this day, I mean, incorporation gives you enormous powers, particularly in limitation of liability. It gives you access. It gives you a number of things. You want to scare a capitalist, you tell them, hey, we should probably repeal acts of incorporation and just go to sole proprietorship and maybe a few small limited liability companies, and they'll run screaming from the room, trust me. So ultimately, in America, we've got two models that fight it out. One model is the Hamiltonian model of what I call, this is just my term, integrated state-sponsored capitalism. Basically, the argument that Hamilton made is, look, we got to have a national bank. And the national bank is going to take care of the government if we have a war. So they'll be able to loan the government money. And now capital will be invested because they'll buy the bonds. And now they're invested in the victory. And we have their loyalty. And in return for that loyalty, we'll give them subsidies, maybe a little tariff on the side, protection and things of this nature. And try to really build this symbiosis, sort of based on what England had done in the past. Now, I'll be fair to Hamilton. He would probably be stunned at what we have today. I mean, back in Hamilton's day, a bank might loan out $1 for every 6 in the bank. Take a look and see what the reserve requirement is on your checking account. They're not creating the money out of thin air, interestingly enough. One of the problems that Uncle Milty had, he was the guy who said, hey, the money supply increases and automatically the price level increases. Not if they don't loan it. Not if they don't loan it. If it doesn't go into circulation, it's not doing anything. That's why I do think universal basic income is coming. They're going to have to get somebody out there to spend. The Jeffersonian model, the agrarian commercial republic, was a lot different. It was like, no. You really don't want the government involved in a lot of this. We don't want that corrupt system of England where you have the stock jobbers and the merchants trying to secure favors from the legislature and the executive branches in return for a revenue. We can do a simple revenue because we export a lot of valuable products. We can fund the government off the exports. What we need is land, and we need laissez-faire. We need a very light touch. Secondly, We are all very different and unique as states and regions. We really need to sort out our own problems and go our own path within the framework of the federal union as we understood it, as a very limited union. And by the way, be careful of the banks, especially fractional reserve lending. It can be devastatingly inflationary, especially for farmers. So you had two different models. And I'll tell you this much, Hamilton is on the side of history. If you look at the 1600s and the rise of the Dutch financial machine, the Bank of England ultimately starts out as the Bank of London, morphs into the Bank of England. The consolidation of government and finance wins. Take a look at France and England in the 1700s. The Bourbons pretty much borrowed on their own credit. England went ahead and borrowed from the Bank of England. The Bourbons ended up in a revolution. They just didn't have enough that they could collateralize to keep the thing going. It seemed to be the way to go. The Jeffersonian moment of this amount of freedom and laissez-faire was interesting. But there's another dark secret I want to mention here before we get into some possible solutions. One of the problems that faces folks when they look at capitalism is they think only of profit. Greedy capitalists going after profit. Or maybe you think, hey, but they're doing a service. Are we at war? They're doing a service in this case, right? They're providing a good, they're providing a service, they're brokering, they're giving us information, they deserve this. Having traded markets for a long time and whatnot, I will tell you right now what big money / old money / smart money is most interested in. They're not interested in the return on the capital, they're interested in the return of the capital first and foremost. There are all kinds of ways that you can hedge your risk, and risk is the thing that is foremost in their minds. Greed scares them. They hate bubbles. Right now, with an overvalued stock market, interestingly enough, so-called smart money is already pulling out. They may be months early on this, but they're already pulling out. They're deadly aware that, hey, I got to preserve the capital. So how do you do that? Well, you have insurance. Right? I mean, the merchant of Venice, of Antonio, just insured the ships. We wouldn't have had the plot, right? You have insurance. Lloyd's of London went bankrupt not long ago, unfortunately. You also have risk management, right? You invest in different things, so you distribute the risk of the investment. But then you have Jacques Coué. How about if the government assumes my risk for me? Or how about this? I forgot to mention in the Hamiltonian system, who's going to pay the interest on those bonds? Well, the taxpayer. So you have a transfer of wealth, do you not? John Taylor was absolutely correct about this. So why can't we get the taxpayer to underwrite some of this risk? Or in today, I like Microsoft. How did Bill Gates become a medical expert? I would love someone to tell me that one. But aside from that, I mean, Microsoft, aside from having Daddy who was tied in high into IBM, he also made a ton of money off of selling his product to public schools and public universities. All taxpayers predominantly. So it's really good work if you can get it. Please take a drive up 270 and you'll see the military-industrial complex in all its beauty up north of DC. Taxpayer money. Somebody's got to fund to some extent this debt that's coming in. Some deal. So if you could get government in some fashion to guarantee your risk, and if you get in trouble overseas, send the Marines, you know, right? If they take over the oil well, hey, we need the Marines, send them in. That is an enormous benefit. And I can tell you right now, capital is timid. That's actually one of the things that Clyde taught me. That very slogan, capital is timid. And it is. And timid capital is looking for the cheapest guarantee for its return of the principal. Then it will worry about the return on the capital. And we overlook this all the time. That's why, one of the reasons why, there's this symbiosis between the two. So the Hamiltonians do win. The Jeffersons have a good run. I argue in a dissertation that the Jeffersons actually win the thing in 1848. The tariff is coming down. Internal improvements are pretty much squashed. There is no bank. You have an independent treasury, and you just added a whole lot of land for the agrarian commercial republic. And then, boy, the Whig Party just flames out and dies. And the next thing you know, you have a regional party, the Republicans, laying down a slave card. It's fascinating. And that war does deal a death blow to all this. I told you I'm going to have to cheer you up because it's almost supper time and I'm seeing all these long faces. I'll tell you what, we'll all go buy silver tomorrow and stick it to J.P. Morgan. Well, so where do we go now? Figuratively, I do not want to arouse the suspicions of the deep state. Figuratively, our models are Marion, Sumter, and Mosley. If you like Harry Gilmore, Captain McNeil, these are the masters of asymmetrical warfare. No, I am not suggesting that you lose a few, learn how to shoot from behind a hill or any of that kind of thing, but I am suggesting that our response has to be asymmetrical, meaning that it has to be underground to some degree and very individualized. That's where we're at. That's the playing field we're on. The people who the reason the bloody shirt is being waved again in politics, right? If you want to be a conservative, you get online and you denounce the South. Sean Hannity, call him up, denounce the South. He'll denounce it along with you. The reason the bloody shirt is once again being waved, as it was in the politics of the 1870s, is it's a unifier. It's a virtue signaling, right? I'm on the right side in this particular case. So suddenly coming out in the forefront and saying, hey, I'm organizing this group to destroy Wall Street. No, they will destroy you first. Ask Max Kaiser. So, figuratively, these fellows. So we have to think asymmetrically. We have to think differently, locally. So, old Wall Street wisdom, first thing, never finance your enemies. You never finance your enemies. Now, be careful here. I do not mean this is dogma. I am not a Puritan. I consider those people blood enemies. But as much as you possibly can, don't walk into a Walmart. Don't walk into a Lowe's. If the local guy has it, go there first. When you're doing your banking, and here Professor Trotter and I will probably get into it a little bit, but I'm not a big fan of Dodd-Frank. And one of the reasons I'm not is that if your institution has $54 billion in assets and it begins to get in trouble, you, the depositors, are on the hook under the law. And this is done in Greece, and they can do it here now too under law. So you might want to look for who's well capitalized, who's not carrying a lot of risk. In other words, we have to do something we don't like to do. We have to take responsibility for things like bank accounts. And where am I actually doing my banking? And what are the ramifications? Dodd-Frank, I'm going to punch Dodd-Frank one last time. It's horrible. It's 1,000-some pages, really? I mean, Glass-Steagall was 38, and it worked really well, and that's why they got rid of it. But we're going to do 1,000 pages of this nonsense? But that is buried in those 1,000 pages. So you have to be aware of those things. You have to do the research and say, okay, where is my money? Don't be so trusting. You all should have grown up in Southern Maryland, which can get a little sporty at times, and you're not so trusting. Don't be so trusting in those cases. So try to do the local thing. Try to grow a garden. Do small things. Don't watch the cat videos. I'm absolutely convinced they're communist propaganda. If you want to think like Southerners of an older age, take Homer down off the shelf, or the Bible, Shakespeare. Fiddle, exactly. Do the things, read the things, shape your mind the way their mind was shaped. The letters from the fellows who fought in the war between the states are incredibly literate. You got to start thinking the way they do. And by the way, I include myself in this, though I tend to watch hunting dog videos, not cat videos. Beware of our great vice. My father was right. He once told me, Johnny, greed will kill the country. He's right. Greed is one of our big vices. So is impatience. We are an exceptionally young country. The great migrations that built us in the 1600s and in 1700s, I would include, of course, the distressed Cavaliers, the Puritans, God love them, the Quakers, Scotch-Irish and British borderers, and also the African Americans. All of them came over from great distress and violence, all of them. Those wars in West Africa were on a huge scale that resulted in these incredible surpluses of prisoners of war that were then shipped and sold over. All of them. And it took a while to sort these colonies out, to do the mimesis, the imitation that had to be done, things of this nature, to plant in and then to adapt to the environment. But we Americans think in terms of decades. The French think in terms of centuries, the Chinese in millennia. My students used to say, why are all these Chinese students here? They're going to take my valedictorian spot and beat me out on the basketball team. And I would say to them, well, they're very interested in you, or at least their parents are, or perhaps the party, whoever sent them. They're very interested in you. They're interested in how you think. They're interested in your culture. Isn't it odd how you're not particularly interested in them? And what a disadvantage that is going to be. A major disadvantage. So again, we have to think on the smaller scale. So we have to start thinking in terms of centuries. What is our heritage, both as Southerners, right, and also as people of the West? What is that heritage? What does it mean to us? We need to think about this and let it shape us again. And we have to play the long game. Y'all, none of this is going to get sorted out in our lifetimes of anyone in this room. And I'm sorry, young people, that includes you. Using trend analysis, it just doesn't look like that's going to happen. Our long game is to A, keep the flames alive, and B, pass it on as best we can. And to be happy, you know, like there was the old Irish proverb my father used to tell me about. You know, the Irish are surrounded on a hill, they're outnumbered 10-1, and they're smiling and laughing. They're saying, finally, the odds are in our favor. And that's the kind of joy we have to bring to it. Murray Rothbard, who was certainly a professional and personal acquaintance of many here, was nicknamed the Happy Warrior. In my few personal encounters with him, I found him to be that. I disagreed with him on a ton of things, but I found him to be a happy warrior. And here's the other thing too, and I'll end on this. I do not advocate Mr. Sand's politics back when he was in the Provisional IRA, but he said two things that came out of a culture that thinks in centuries, and the Irish used to, the Spanish used to. And two things that he said regarding the British, the laughter of our children will be our revenge. The second thing that he said was they have nothing in their entire imperial arsenal that will break the spirit of one Irishman who does not want to be broken. That wasn't the Marxist part of him. That was speaking out over 7 centuries of conflict and resistance to a tyranny. We got to think that way. So think Reconquista, think those types of things. And let's keep joy in our hearts, because as St. Paul says, we must be able to give an account to others of the joy that is within us. Thank you all so much for listening.